Campside Media.
Hey, Campside listeners. Welcome back to Inside the Tent, the show where we go behind the microphone of our favorite podcasts and talk to the people who brought them to life. My name is Matthew Scher, and I'm one of the co-founders at Campside Media. Today, I'm talking to the journalist Mosi Secret about Radical, a podcast that explores the mysteries behind a 2000 shooting between law enforcement and a former activist named Jamil Al-Amin. If you want more exclusive content or behind-the-scenes anecdotes from our shows, make sure to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com. So, Mosi, thanks for coming on and talking about this show. I wondered if we could start with the origins, which are a little different than the way a show often gets off the ground. In this case, we had a producer, Johnny, who'd been digging into some of this material for a while, right? And you come in sort of, the train has started to leave the station, or the train is in motion. I don't know exactly what the right metaphor is, but walk us through some of that, through that part of the process.
Yeah, so Johnny Kauffman started submitting public records requests for court documents and police documents about a year before I was even involved with the project. He had heard about this notorious shooting in Atlanta where the person who was convicted, who the show is about, a man, Jamil Al-Amin, kind of maintained his innocence over a period of years. So Johnny started filing public records requests and having preliminary conversations with people, but knew from pretty early on that he didn't want to be the host of the show. I came to Johnny through you, Matt, quite serendipitously, was just kind of calling around to learn more about the podcasting industry and had some other ideas for shows. And you guys told me that you guys needed a host for this show. And it was like this kind of weird moment for me because I realized that the show checked all of these boxes for me, or it basically was an extension of all the things that I've done in my life. It was based in Atlanta, where I'm from. It was based in the community that I had grown up around. It was like court and criminal record stuff, which is what my experience is with. And it was dealing with all of these kind of big religious and philosophical issues. And I studied religion in college. And so it felt like this gift to me of a story that I was supposed to tell. And so at that point, I came in and started working with you guys.
You mentioned that you grew up in Atlanta, and you talk about this in the podcast a little bit, but can you explain for the listeners to this show, before you started reporting, how much did you know about this case? How much of it did you understand or know about?
So, yes, I think we can say what we're talking about here. There was a shooting that happened in March of 2000 where a couple of sheriff's deputies were involved in a shootout with an imam of a local Atlanta mosque. This happened actually while I was away at college, but it was something that everybody was talking about. And so I certainly heard about it through family, and I don't know if it would have been through the papers, but I certainly heard about it through family, that this person who we knew was accused of being involved in this shooting. At that time, I don't recall having a sense of whether I thought that he did it. I wasn't close enough to what happened to really have had thoughts one way or the other about that. But I do recall thinking that he could have done it based on his history, but that most people thought that he didn't do it. But that's really as deep into it as I got. Like, it wasn't even something that lasted in my consciousness probably for more than a week or two, and then I had moved on. It wasn't like I followed the case or anything like that.
I want to pause here to say that this shooting, it did not exist in a vacuum, right? In the year that it occurred, there was a lot happening in the United States politically, especially. There's a lot happening overseas involving the US, but a lot happening internally, especially when it comes to the Muslim population in the US. And that's sort of one of the contexts here, right?
Yeah. Jamil Al-Amin was a part of the African-American Muslim community, which has roots in the Nation of Islam and other kind of Black nationalist movements. But there was also all this stuff happening around that time in the international Muslim community that law enforcement connected him with, rightly or wrongly. The shooting happened in the year 2000, as I mentioned, but the trial didn't happen until 2002. So that means, in the middle of that period is September 11th, 2001. And that really created the environment in which he was tried. The trial was scheduled to begin. I think jury selection was supposed to start the day before 9/11. And then the trial got pushed back because of all of the upheaval that surrounded that day. And so in the trial, there was a lot of what could be considered anti-Muslim sentiment that came in from the prosecution. Mostly that was the accusation. And his defense lawyers even tried to call for a mistrial because of some things that happened. And so there were a lot of questions about not only was the trial fair, but even was he framed as a result of this sentiment of that time.
You think about all the layers that are in this story, and on the one hand, there's the story of the shooting itself. On the other, there's the political and cultural context. And then the third, which you get at so well in the podcast, is Al-Amin's history, right? His own personal history in the civil rights era. He sort of lived multiple lives. Can you tell us a little bit about how he first became an activist and a bit about his history in the movement?
Yeah, so he came of age in the Jim Crow South, was born into segregated society in Louisiana, and like many young people at that time, bucked against that system. He became a student organizer, mostly in the South, and rose to leadership in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And as the leader of what we call SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he was much more militant than others who had preceded him. He was calling openly for armed resistance to state oppression, armed resistance to white racial violence. And for that reason, really raised a lot of alarms for people in local and federal law enforcement. And so, this is the age of COINTELPRO, of the FBI's counterintelligence efforts in infiltrating all of these Black and leftist groups. And he was one of the main targets of that. And over the course of his young life and into his older adult age, he was surveilled and targeted by the FBI. And so a big part of the show is to what extent that surveillance continued into his later years after he converted to Islam and moved to Atlanta and became an imam, and whether that played into the events surrounding the shooting.
I want to be really careful here about how much we give away or how much we spoil for people. But I do want to ask this, and you're going to have to use a little bit of creativity in how you answer it so as not to spoil it. You arrive at some answers at the end of this show. Talk to me about what the journey getting there was like, and also how you felt when you sort of put the pieces together in those final episodes.
It was a really personal journey for me because the community that my family in Atlanta is still involved in is very close to the community, or at least in proximity to the community that Jamil Al-Amin came from. So I was concerned from the beginning, no matter what I found, that there would be consequences for my family. So the project evolved from its early stages. In the beginning, I decided that I would be a dispassionate fact finder, that I would just kind of lay all of the facts on the table, and I wouldn't draw any conclusions, and I would let the listener decide what happened. But the deeper I got into the story, the more personally affected I was by the things that I was learning about, and the more that I wanted to not only declare what I thought happened, but talk about how I felt about what happened. And so the show became, for me, quite personal, but also quite risky in how much I chose to put myself out there in making some of these statements. So that doesn't really say, what I think happened, but we'll just call it a challenging journey for me to get to where we were in episode 8.
Did you get feedback from friends and family who were uncomfortable in any way with what you'd done in the show?
Yes, definitely. Mostly before I finished and before they heard it, because people are just, their imaginations are running wild. They don't really know what's coming. Afterward, I mostly got compliments. And I think it spoke to the care with which we handled the subject and how great we did with the writing and with the storytelling. It was such that even people who disagreed with us came forward to say, you guys did a great job.
I want to ask you one of my favorite questions that I ask a lot of people who have come from a print background or print reporting background and have done a podcast. What was that transition like for you?
I'd done one show before, just a single episode of This American Life. So I had a little bit of experience of kind of writing for the ear and using sentence structure that was understandable kind of on the first listen. But still, this was significantly longer and significantly more complex than the piece that I'd done before. And so it was a bit of a transition. And I remember the early stages of working with Johnny were mostly you're writing too long. He'd be like, Mosi, this is beautiful, but it's too long. This is too much. This is too much text, too much narration without enough tape. And so for me, what I really had to learn how to do in the early episodes was to, I don't want to say simplify, but let's just say streamline my writing. And so that's what I worked on. But I will say that even after that, I was kind of pushing Johnny. I was pushing the limits, I felt like, of what was considered like normal for the amount of narration. Like I was still on the outside of it, but I was like, Johnny, we need this. And he ended up agreeing with me in the end. But that was our main struggle, I think.
Are there things that you feel like you can't do in audio that you can do in print? I can think of a few things. I'll just give you an example. With audio, you need people's voices. You need their voice presence, for lack of a better term. Where in print, you can describe things, you can get people on background, you can get them off the record to gain more information. And in podcasting, you are unarmed with those particular tools.
Yeah, to me, that's the main thing, is that if we're talking about character-driven narratives, the main thing for me is in print, you can set a scene in which you are a fly on the wall and things are happening in front of you and people are not necessarily verbalizing what they're feeling. You can allude to those feelings and those changes in what's happening to them through other writing techniques. In audio, people have to say everything. And so for me, I remember in the early days of my reporting for audio, it was a little bit uncomfortable because I felt like I was disturbing scenes more than I would be if I were just kind of like, leaning against a wall and watching. And so that was one of the big things. But on the other hand, in audio, the quotes are often much better because you're pushing people to really get to the heart of what they're feeling. And on occasions where I've co-reported a print piece alongside an audio piece, I found myself using some of the quotes that we'd gotten from audio in the print piece because they were so much richer and clearer than the ones that I'd gotten just chilling against a wall. So that would be one of the biggest things that I found is different. But, like you're saying, also being able to get people on background and off the record for print stories, especially with investigative work where you are often putting people in compromising positions. If they talk to you, there's a lot that you can do by promising them that you're not going to use their name. But if you do that throughout an audio piece, you won't have a story. And so that's the challenge.
As a last question, I want you to talk about the public records and record sleuthing and unearthing that happened in this show. It's part of what makes it so amazing. The writing makes it amazing, but the amount of journalistic digging that went into this is extraordinary. So here's the last two questions sort of twinned together. What did you learn from this process in terms of, you already know you're an experienced, seasoned reporter who's done lots of public records work. What did you learn from it? And what did it add to the show in your mind, being able to come up with that information?
Well, I have to tip my hat here to the producer of the show, Johnny Kauffman, who did most, if not all, of the public records searches. And he was filing public information requests to the Fulton County Prosecutor's Office. There we have some stuff that he got from Jamil Al-Amin's defense team. And there might have been some other kind of law enforcement people who we got documents from. But, what I saw in watching Johnny was what I knew, but what I could see from a distance this time is just the value of persistence. I mean, we were blocked on many occasions from getting things that we were legally entitled to. That's something that you often run up against when you're doing public records requests, is that the public records officer, usually under the direction of some higher person in the office, comes up with some reason to deny you something. And Johnny just really wasn't trying to have that this time. He was really principled about the fact that these records were entitled to us. He got lawyers involved and was able to get not only documents, but key for a podcast, audio recordings that really made the show. I mean, for example, we have recordings that were taken of Jamil Al-Amin when he was on the run from police after the shooting. That's great. You can't get that after the fact from going around interviewing people. We have audio from the radio calls after the shooting. All of these really rich things that create a sense of being there for listeners were a result of the public records process and Johnny just being really persistent.
Well, it's an extraordinary achievement. It truly is, this show. And if people are listening and haven't listened to the show themselves, change that immediately.
Change it.
Change it. Mosi, thank you so much for doing this. Truly, we appreciate it.
All right. It's fun to talk, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Mosi Secret and the rest of the Radical team. And thank you for listening to Inside the Tent. If you haven't done so already, don't forget to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com.